Hi, my name is Laura Keel, and today I will be presenting on negative reinforcement. The definition for negative reinforcement is that it is contingent of the occurrence of a response that produces removal, termination, reduction, or postponement of a stimulus. So this leads to an increase in the future occurrence of that response. And there are four term contingencies that you should be aware of, and that is establishing operation, discriminative stimulus, response, and reinforce. What I really like about in the book is that they take this term and they introduce it to you, and then they kind of compare it to positive reinforcement and punishment, which I really think helps to understand what negative reinforcement is. So first I'm going to start with positive versus negative reinforcement. I didn't just want to go over the differences with this one, but I also wanted to go over the similarities, which is that they both are meant to increase in responding. So whatever kind of response you're looking for, you want that to be increased. The difference is the type of stimulus change that follows behavior. So for positive reinforcement, stimulus is absent prior to responding, and in negative reinforcement, reinforcement terminates the stimulus that was present prior to responding. And if you look, I took a picture from within our textbook, and it's on page 293, and it kind of gives you an example of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. For the positive reinforcement, they talk about how a child missed lunch at school, and then the older sibling present when child gets home, and that child asks the sibling to make a sandwich, and then the sibling makes a sandwich for the child, which they consume. So it kind of goes over, what the stimulus was and the response, and then what the effect was after. For negative reinforcement, in the example, it talks about how rain starts to fall and lands on clothes, and there's a newsstand nearby for a person, and then they buy a newspaper and use it to cover themselves, and then they understand that the effects of rain on clothes is diminished. So it's interesting to kind of go through these examples to see it. I like the visual representation of it, but if you are interested in more examples, there are additional examples on page 292 and 293, and they do a wonderful job on the text kind of outlining different examples so you can understand the difference. And now I'm going to talk about negative reinforcement versus punishment, and these two terms are most commonly confused. Negative reinforcement is mistakenly correlated to punishment, and what they describe in the book is that, we most commonly correlate negative and positives with good or bad. So we assume that negative means that it's something bad, when really negative reinforcement is when you're presenting that stimulus is terminated by a response and it's leading to an increase in response. And punishment is when no stimulus is presented until after response, and that leads to a decrease in responding. So the main difference there is that negative reinforcement is increasing in responding, and punishment is leading to decrease in the responding. When we go through talking about negative reinforcement, the book outlines escape and avoidance contingencies, and this was probably the most interesting section for me, because I work with students who tend to have behaviors, and not all the time do we kind of openly talk about these kind of contingencies. So an escape contingency is a response that terminates an ongoing stimulus. An avoidance contingency is a response that prevents or postpones the presentation of a stimulus. There's discriminated avoidance, which is responding in the presence of a signal prevents the onset of a stimulus from which escape is a reinforcer. Pre-operant avoidance, which is avoidance behavior is free to occur at any time and will delay the response. In the book on page 294, they do a really nice job of providing some examples. And they talk about lab rats. And for an escape contingency, they talk about when a rat was placed in an experimental chamber, a bright light was turned on, and the rat would quickly learn to press the lever, and that would turn on the light, and that would allow them to kind of get a break, which is kind of their escape contingency from whatever task they wanted them to do there. And within the avoidance contingency, what they would present the rat with the same thing, and the bright light would come on again, and there would be a response in addition, which was a tone. And that would eliminate the presentation of the light or postpone it until the next tone was presented. So they kind of had a way to avoid that. There are different characteristics of negative reinforcement, and I kind of wrote them all out here, and then I'm going to break up and talk about them. So there's a maintained responses, events, learning history, the source, context, and factors that influence effectiveness. Maintained responses has to deal with responses that were terminated from the stimulus, tends to help them be strengthened. And in the book, they kind of go over that a variety of behaviors can be acquired and maintained by negative reinforcement, because they believe that the termination of responses with the stimulus can help strengthen those behaviors. I put events and learning history together because I felt like they kind of correlated together when it came to the terms. And for negative reinforcement, we talk about how it influences behavior, and they believe that because humans have an inherited capacity to respond to them. And also, the effects have been established through a history of learning. And there are two different kinds of negative reinforcement, and they talked about unconditioned and conditioned. Unconditioned negative reinforcement is when stimuli whose removal strengthens behavior in the absence of prior learning. And this occurs during certain events, which could be a shock or a loud noise, intense light, high or low temperatures, or strong pressure. So that stimulus during that event might cause the different reactions. And a conditioned negative reinforcement is a previously neutral event that acquire their effects through pairing with an existing negative reinforcement. And they had some really great examples in the book. And the example event that I thought was spot on was when they talked about a dark sky. And if you were going to go on a bike ride, you might not go when you see a dark sky coming in, because you've kind of learned that that would mean that it might rain and that you're going to get rained on during your bike ride. The source is something that we have to consider for negative reinforcement, because it may help design a behavior change intervention by helping to decide the focus of the intervention. And what they talked about with negative reinforcement for the interventions is that there could be two sources, which could be a social source or an automatic source. And in the book, they kind of have examples about social, dealing with roommates, and if it's being bothered, or noise, and how you would handle that. And for automatic, they might talk about if you have a headache, what would you automatically do to kind of relieve that? You might take medication. So for the context of negative reinforcement, we should have equal emphasis on the antecedent event as well as on the reinforcing consequence. And the reason they want you to understand how that is working is so that you know if it's a positive or a negative reinforcement. If you don't really understand how the consequence goes with the antecedent, you might not be able to identify quick enough if it's positive or negative reinforcement, because sometimes there are natural consequences that happen that could be considered negative reinforcement. And in order to evaluate how well a reinforcement is working or not working, we need to understand exactly what specific consequences are happening to the antecedent. Some factors that influence the effectiveness of negative reinforcement. The first one is that the stimulus change immediately follows the occurrence of the target response. 2, the magnitude of reinforcement is large, referring to the difference in stimulation present before and after the response occurs. Occurrence of the target response consistently produces escape from or postponement of the EO. And 4, reinforcement is unavailable for competing responses. And this was kind of a short section in the book, but I thought it was important to add in here for the factors that influence. And I also wanted you to keep in mind that it's related to kind of the strength of the contingency and the presence of competing contingencies when you're doing negative reinforcement. When talking about applications of negative reinforcement, there were 3 areas: acquisition and maintenance of appropriate behavior, acquisition and maintenance of problem behavior, and behavioral replacement strategies. I was going to start with the acquisition and maintenance of appropriate behavior. So research supports the positive reinforcement over negative reinforcement, but there are a couple different scenarios where research has shown that negative reinforcement tends to be more beneficial. And one is in pediatric feeding problems, where they kind of recommend the use of negative reinforcement. And they kind of give you some examples about how if children are kind of refusing to eat, how negative reinforcement could be the best way to help them intervene and make progress there. And they one quote that I really liked from the book that when they talked about this particular situation is that positive reinforcement for appropriate behavior may have limited effects if other behaviors produce negative reinforcement. And that negative reinforcement that maintains problem behavior can be used to establish alternative behavior. Another situation that they discussed using negative reinforcement was error correction strategies. That's kind of the correction of student errors by repeating a learning trial. It could be providing the student with an additional work or repeating a learning trial if they have significant errors. The acquisition and maintenance of problem behavior. Sometimes presentation of tasks may function as an escape behavior due to the difficulty of work. And when they talked about these problem behaviors, it was something that maybe was coming out that was even more negative, even though you were using that negative reinforcement. And the research on the assessment and treatment of the problem behaviors has showed us that escape from task demands is a common source of negative reinforcement for destruction of property, aggression, and even self-injury. It's important to understand if some problem behaviors are being maintained by negative reinforcement. So once again, it's kind of that check of what's the antecedent and the consequence, and is maybe for a problem behavior there a negative reinforcement that we really aren't aware of or aren't understanding. Some behavior replacement strategies. They talk about treating problem behaviors maintained by negative reinforcement, and their main purpose, they said, in order to help that is to strengthen more socially appropriate replacement behaviors, that you could still use negative reinforcement to do so. Another interesting section in this negative reinforcement chapter was the ethical considerations. There were three main concerns, and the one was that it was kind of viewed as aversive events, and that it could also generate behaviors that compete with the acquisition, and also that there could be undesirable side effects. Three questions that I've kind of outlined for everyone are: what are benefits to using negative reinforcement? What are the differences between an escape contingency and an avoidance contingency? And what are some examples of negative reinforcement? I appreciate you listening to my presentation. Please feel free to come up with any questions. Thank you.